The meeting took place at 8 in the morning in the conference room of Prestige Construction Group's headquarters. Ruth Williams arrived wearing her best church dress and carrying a worn leather purse that had belonged to her mother. She brought Jerome with her, along with Marcus Thompson, an experienced property lawyer who had agreed to represent her after hearing about the case. Across the polished mahogany table sat 5 people in expensive suits. Richard Prestige, the company's founder and CEO, looked like a man who hadn't slept well in days. His face was pale and his usually perfect hair seemed disheveled. Beside him sat the company's head lawyer, 2 city officials who had approved the original land sale, and a representative from the title insurance company that was supposed to have prevented exactly this kind of mistake. The room felt tense as Marcus Thompson spread out copies of the original land deed, property surveys, and legal documents that proved Ruth's ownership. Richard Prestige studied the papers with the intensity of a man watching his life's work crumble before his eyes. He had built his company's reputation on attention to detail and thorough research. This mistake could destroy everything he had worked for over 20 years. The city officials were equally uncomfortable. Mayor Patricia Holmes had been in office when the sale was approved, and she knew that taxpayers would demand answers about how such a massive error could happen. The mistake would likely cost the city millions in legal fees and settlements, not to mention the political damage to everyone involved in the approval process. Ruth listened quietly as the lawyers and officials discussed the technical aspects of the case. She learned that title insurance was supposed to protect against exactly this situation, but the insurance company was already arguing that the city's computer error from 1987 had made it impossible for them to detect the problem. Everyone was pointing fingers at everyone else, trying to avoid responsibility for the $15 million mistake. What struck Ruth most was how differently people treated her compared to 3 days earlier. Before the land ownership was discovered, she had been invisible to these powerful people. Now they hung on her every word, asking about her preferences and what she hoped to achieve. The same politicians who had never returned her calls about potholes in her neighborhood were now offering to expedite any city services she might need. Jerome had done his homework thoroughly. He presented evidence that the land's value had increased dramatically over the decades, especially after the city had rezoned the area for residential development in 2019. If Ruth had known she owned the property and been able to develop it herself, she could have made millions of dollars. The lawyers called this lost opportunity costs, and it added up to a staggering amount of money. But Ruth was more interested in the human side of the story. She asked about the families who had bought homes in Willowbrook Estates. Most were young couples with children who had saved for years to afford their dream homes. They had paid fair market prices and had no idea they were buying houses built on disputed land. Some families had used their entire life savings for down payments. Richard Prestige explained that his company had followed all normal procedures when acquiring the land. They had worked with city planners, obtained proper permits, and paid for surveys and inspections. The title search had shown clear ownership by the city, and all the paperwork had been approved by multiple officials. From their perspective, they had done everything right, and were now facing financial ruin through no fault of their own. The insurance representative suggested that the best solution would be for Ruth to accept a cash settlement and transfer ownership to Prestige Construction. This would allow the current homeowners to keep their houses and give Ruth enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. The number they mentioned was substantial, but far less than the land's actual value. Marcus Thompson rejected this proposal immediately. He argued that Ruth shouldn't have to give up her family's land just to solve everyone else's problems. The land had been in the Williams family for over 80 years, and Ruth had every right to decide its future. If Prestige Construction wanted to keep the houses they had built, they would need to pay fair market value for the land, plus damages for decades of unauthorized use. The meeting lasted 4 hours without reaching any agreement. Ruth requested time to think about her options and consult with her family. She promised to provide an answer within 2 weeks, giving everyone involved time to explore alternative solutions. As Ruth left the building, reporters were waiting outside. Word of the case had spread beyond the local newspaper, and television crews from 3 neighboring cities had come to cover the story. Ruth found herself uncomfortable with the attention, but answered a few questions about her family's connection to the land and her grandfather's original purchase. That evening, Ruth's small house was busier than it had been in years. Family members, neighbors, and old friends stopped by to offer advice and support. Everyone had an opinion about what she should do. Some encouraged her to take whatever money she could get and enjoy her remaining years without stress. Others urged her to fight for every penny the land was worth, arguing that her family had been denied opportunities for too long. Ruth's great-niece, Keisha, a recent college graduate with a degree in social work, pointed out that the situation was about more than money. It represented a pattern of Black families being denied the wealth that comes from property ownership, often due to systemic problems and bureaucratic errors that were never corrected. Keisha argued that Ruth had a responsibility to future generations, to claim her full rights and not settle for less than she deserved. As the visitors left and the house grew quiet, Ruth sat at her kitchen table with Jerome, looking through old family photos. Pictures of her grandfather Ezra, her parents, and relatives who had worked the land decades earlier. She thought about the dreams they had carried and the sacrifices they had made to hold onto this piece of earth. Their legacy had unexpectedly placed her in a position of tremendous power, but also tremendous responsibility. Marcus Thompson wasn't the kind of lawyer Sarah had expected to find. Instead of a fancy office with leather chairs and law books lining the walls, he worked out of a small space above a barbershop in East Atlanta. His desk was covered with stacks of papers, and he answered his own phone. But when Sarah told him her story, something in his eyes lit up with the kind of fire she hadn't seen in any of the other lawyers she had contacted. Marcus had grown up hearing similar stories from his own grandmother. Black families losing land to tax sales, developers swooping in to buy property for pennies on the dollar, and generations of wealth disappearing because of missed notices and unpaid bills. He had become a lawyer specifically to fight these kinds of cases, even though they rarely paid well and almost never made headlines. The first thing Marcus did was order a complete title search on Sarah's property. This meant tracing every single transaction, sale, and legal document related to the land going back to when her great-great-grandfather first bought it in 1923. What they discovered was even worse than Sarah had imagined. The original deed showed that her great-great-grandfather, Samuel Williams, had paid $800 for the 47 acres in 1923. That was a lot of money for a black man in Georgia at that time. Samuel had worked double shifts at a lumber mill for 3 years to save enough for the down payment, then spent another 10 years paying off the balance. Family stories said he wanted to leave something valuable for his children and grandchildren. But the paper trail showed problems almost immediately. When Samuel died in 1949, the land should have passed to his children according to his will. However, there was no record that the property had ever been properly transferred. Samuel's children had continued to pay taxes on the land for decades, but legally, the county still listed Samuel as the owner. This created a mess that lawyers call heirs' property. When someone dies and their property isn't properly transferred to their heirs through the courts, the land can get stuck in legal limbo. The heirs might continue to use and pay taxes on the property, but they don't have clear legal title. This makes the land vulnerable to tax sales, forced sales, and other legal problems. Marcus explained to Sarah that this was a common problem in Black communities across the South. Many families had informal arrangements about who owned what land, but they didn't have the money or knowledge to file the proper legal paperwork when family members died. As a result, millions of acres of Black-owned land had been lost over the decades. The tax sale in 1987 had been technically legal, but Marcus believed it violated Sarah's family's constitutional rights. The county had sent tax notices to Samuel Williams at the property address, even though he had been dead for almost 40 years. When the letters came back undelivered, the county had published a notice in the legal section of the local newspaper for 3 weeks, then proceeded with the sale. The problem was that none of Samuel's descendants lived on the property by 1987. They had all moved to Atlanta and other cities looking for work. Sarah's grandmother had been paying the taxes through the mail, but when she moved apartments and forgot to update her address with the county, the tax bills started going to the wrong place. Marcus filed a lawsuit in Riverside County Superior Court in February 2020, just as the world was starting to hear about something called COVID-19. The lawsuit claimed that the 1987 tax sale had violated Sarah's family's due process rights under the 14th Amendment. It argued that the county hadn't made reasonable efforts to contact the actual owners of the property, and that the sale should be declared invalid. The lawsuit named as defendants the county, the development company that had bought the land, and the homeowners association that now managed the Riverside Estates neighborhood. This meant that Sarah was essentially suing nearly 100 families who had bought homes in the development, most of whom had no idea there was any problem with their property titles. The response was immediate and intense. The development company hired one of Atlanta's most expensive law firms to fight the case. They argued that Sarah had waited too long to challenge the sale, that the statute of limitations had expired decades ago, and that innocent homeowners shouldn't have to suffer because of problems with old property records. The homeowners in Riverside Estates were terrified. Many had put their life savings into their houses. They had mortgages, home insurance, and property taxes based on their belief that they legally owned their homes. The idea that someone could come along and claim their entire neighborhood was built on land that didn't belong to the developers was their worst nightmare. Local news stations picked up the story in March 2020, just as the pandemic was shutting down everything else. The coverage was not kind to Sarah. Television reporters interviewed worried homeowners standing in front of their beautiful houses, talking about how a woman they had never met was trying to take away their homes. Sarah was portrayed as a greedy opportunist trying to get rich by taking advantage of legal technicalities. The stress was overwhelming for Sarah. She had to keep working at the grocery store to pay her bills, but customers who recognized her from the news would make nasty comments. Her boys came home from school asking why other kids were saying their mom was trying to steal people's houses. The apartment complex where she lived received so many angry phone calls that the manager asked her to consider moving. Marcus warned Sarah that this was exactly what would happen. Big legal cases involving property and race always got ugly in the media. He told her that if she wanted to drop the case, he would understand. But Sarah refused to back down. She had learned more about her family's history in the past few months than she had known her entire life, and she wasn't going to let that history be erased. The legal battle moved slowly through the court system. The defendants filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed. They argued that Sarah lacked standing to sue, that the statute of limitations had expired, that the county had followed proper procedures, and that overturning the tax sale would create chaos in property ownership across Georgia. Marcus countered each argument with careful legal research. He found cases from other states where courts had overturned decades-old tax sales for similar constitutional violations. He located other black families who had lost land in Riverside County under questionable circumstances. He even found evidence that the county had been particularly aggressive in tax sales during the 1980s, targeting properties in predominantly black areas. The case also attracted attention from civil rights organizations and law schools. Students from Emory University and Georgia State University started volunteering to help with research. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund offered to file supporting briefs. National organizations focused on black land loss reached out to offer assistance and expertise. By the end of 2020, Sarah's case had become much bigger than just one woman trying to reclaim her family's property. It had become a symbol of the broader fight to address historical injustices in property ownership and to protect black families from continuing to lose their land through legal technicalities and bureaucratic failures. But the real battle was just beginning. The developers and homeowners were not going to give up easily, and they had resources that Sarah could never match. As 2021 began, both sides were preparing for a legal war that would determine not just who owned 47 acres in Riverside County, but whether the legal system would finally begin to address the massive loss of black-owned land across the American South. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Liu was a second-year law student at Emory University who had volunteered to help Marcus research Sarah's case. While other students focused on legal precedents and constitutional arguments, Jennifer became fascinated by the historical details. She spent her spring break in 2021 digging through old courthouse records, newspaper archives, and property documents that hadn't been digitized yet. What Jennifer found in a dusty filing cabinet in the basement of the Riverside County Courthouse changed everything. Hidden among property records from the 1980s was a folder marked Special Assessment Districts. Inside that folder were documents that revealed a coordinated plan by county officials and private developers to acquire Black-owned property throughout Riverside County through aggressive tax enforcement. The documents showed that in 1985, 2 years before Sarah's family lost their land, the county had created a special task force to identify underutilized properties that could be returned to productive use. The task force had specifically targeted rural properties owned by Black families who lived in other counties. The plan was to accelerate tax sales on these properties, then sell them to developers at below-market prices to encourage economic development. Even more shocking was a memo from the county tax assessor to the county commissioner, dated 6 months before Sarah's land was sold. The memo identified the Williams property as a priority target because of its proximity to the planned interstate highway expansion. The assessor noted that the current owners appear to have moved and may not be aware of pending tax obligations. This memo was the smoking gun Marcus had been hoping to find. It proved that county officials knew Sarah's family might not receive tax notices, but they had proceeded with the sale anyway. Instead of making extra efforts to contact the property owners, they had deliberately taken advantage of the family's absence to acquire valuable land cheaply. Jennifer's discovery led to more research and more shocking revelations. The Special Assessment Task Force had targeted over 200 properties owned by Black families between 1985 and 1990. Most of these families lived in Atlanta or other cities and used their rural properties as weekend retreats, family gathering places, or simply held on to them as family heritage. When tax notices went to empty properties or old addresses, the task force had moved quickly to seize and sell the land. The total value of the land taken through this program was estimated at over $50 million in today's money. Most of it had been sold to a small group of connected developers for a fraction of its actual worth. Some of the same developers who bought Sarah's family land had also purchased dozens of other properties through the same questionable process. Marcus immediately filed an amended lawsuit that included these new discoveries. The case was no longer just about one family's property rights. It was now about a systematic conspiracy by government officials to steal land from Black families. The legal claims expanded to include violations of the Civil Rights Act, conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, and fraud. The defendants' response was swift and aggressive. They claimed that the documents Jennifer had found were taken out of context, that the Special Assessment Program was a legitimate economic development initiative, and that any problems with individual tax sales were isolated mistakes rather than part of a broader conspiracy. The development company's lawyers also launched a personal attack on Sarah and her legal team. They hired private investigators to dig into Sarah's background, looking for anything they could use to discredit her. They questioned why she had waited so long to challenge the tax sale, suggested that she was being manipulated by lawyers looking to make money from racial grievances, and argued that she was trying to destroy an entire community for her own financial gain. The pressure on Sarah intensified dramatically. Someone leaked her personal information online, including her home address and phone number. She started receiving threatening phone calls and emails from people who blamed her for threatening property values throughout the county. Her apartment was vandalized twice, and her car tires were slashed while she was at work. The harassment extended to her children. Her twin boys, now 14, faced constant bullying at school. Other kids called their mother a thief and a troublemaker. Teachers seemed uncomfortable around the boys, and Sarah noticed that they were being excluded from school activities and social events. The stress was taking a toll on the whole family, but Sarah also began receiving support from unexpected places. Other Black families who had lost land in Riverside County started contacting Marcus's office. They had heard about Sarah's case in the news and realized that they might have been victims of the same systematic land grab. Some still had old deeds and tax documents that supported their own claims. A group of local Black churches organized to support Sarah's legal battle. They held prayer meetings for her family, raised money to help with legal expenses, and provided emotional support when the harassment became overwhelming. The pastor of Sarah's grandmother's old church told her that Mama Rose would be proud of her courage in fighting for the family's land. National civil rights organizations also stepped up their involvement. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund assigned 2 of their best lawyers to work with Marcus on the case. The National Black Land Loss Prevention Project provided research and expert witnesses. Law professors from Harvard and Howard University offered to file friend-of-the-court briefs supporting Sarah's legal arguments. The case also attracted attention from historians and academics who studied black land loss. Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor at Duke University, had written extensively about the systematic theft of black-owned land across the South. She testified as an expert witness that Sarah's case fit a clear pattern of discriminatory government actions designed to separate black families from their property. The media coverage began to shift as more details about the county's special assessment program became public. Instead of focusing on worried homeowners potentially losing their houses, reporters started investigating the broader pattern of land loss in Riverside County. An investigative series by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution revealed that the county's aggressive tax enforcement had disproportionately affected black property owners, while white families with similar tax issues had often been given additional time and assistance to resolve their problems. By the summer of 2021, Sarah's case had become a national symbol of the fight to address historical injustices in property ownership. She was invited to speak at conferences about black land loss, interviewed by national news programs, and profiled in major magazines. The shy grocery store clerk who had stumbled across an old deed in her kitchen drawer had become the face of a movement to restore stolen land to black families. But the legal battle was far from over. The defendants had deep pockets and experienced lawyers who were determined to fight every aspect of Sarah's claims. They filed appeals, requested delays, and challenged every piece of evidence that Marcus and his team presented. The case that had started as a simple property dispute was becoming one of the most complex and closely watched civil rights cases in the country. As fall 2021 approached, both sides were preparing for a trial that would determine not just who owned 47 acres in rural Georgia, but whether the American legal system was ready to confront the systematic theft of black wealth that had been happening for generations. For Sarah, the stakes couldn't be higher. She was fighting not just for her family's land, but for justice for all the families who had lost their heritage to greed and discrimination. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in January 2022. The Riverside County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. News trucks lined the street, protesters gathered on both sides of the issue, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and community members. Judge Rebecca Martinez had to bring in extra security to manage the crowds and maintain order. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table wearing her best dress, the same one she had worn to her grandmother's funeral. Her hands shook as she looked around the courtroom at all the attention her case had attracted. Marcus squeezed her shoulder and reminded her that they had prepared for this moment for almost 2 years. They had the evidence, they had the law on their side, and they had the truth. The defendant's table looked like a corporate boardroom. 3 different law firms represented the various parties, with more than a dozen lawyers in expensive suits arranging stacks of documents and legal briefs. The lead attorney for the development company was Richard Sterling, one of Atlanta's most famous trial lawyers, known for winning impossible cases through aggressive tactics and courtroom theatrics. Judge Martinez was a fair but tough Latina woman who had grown up poor in South Georgia before working her way through law school. She had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from either side and for making decisions based on law rather than politics. Both legal teams had researched her background extensively, looking for clues about how she might rule on the complex constitutional and property law issues in the case. Sterling opened for the defense with a polished presentation about the importance of property rights and legal certainty. He argued that Sarah's claims, no matter how sympathetic, couldn't be allowed to overturn decades of settled property ownership. He pointed to the nearly 100 families who had bought homes in good faith, invested their life savings, and built their lives in riverside estates. Sterling painted a picture of chaos that would result if old tax sales could be challenged decades later. He argued that every property owner in Georgia would have to worry about someone showing up with an old deed, claiming their land had been stolen. The legal system, he claimed, required statutes of limitations to provide certainty and finality to property transactions. Marcus's opening statement took a completely different approach. Instead of focusing on legal technicalities, he told the story of systematic land theft that had robbed Black families of generational wealth across the South. He showed the jury photographs of Samuel Williams, Sarah's great-great-grandfather, standing proudly on his newly purchased land in 1923. He explained how decades of hard work and sacrifice had been stolen through a deliberate conspiracy between government officials and private developers. The first week of trial focused on establishing the basic facts about the Williams family property. Marcus called Sarah's elderly aunts and uncles to testify about family gatherings on the land, about paying taxes year after year, and about never receiving any notice that the property was being sold for unpaid taxes. Their testimony was powerful, but also heartbreaking, as they described watching their family heritage disappear while they struggled with poverty in the city. Sterling's cross-examination of the family members was brutal. He questioned why they had moved away from the property, why they hadn't maintained better records, and why they had waited so long to challenge the tax sale. He suggested that the family had essentially abandoned the land and had no right to complain when the county followed legal procedures to collect unpaid taxes. The second week of trial featured testimony from county officials about the 1987 tax sale. The retired tax assessor who had overseen the sale claimed that proper procedures had been followed and that the county had made reasonable efforts to contact the property owners. He denied that there had been any deliberate attempt to target Black-owned property or to take advantage of families who lived far from their rural land. But Marcus had done his homework. Using the documents that Jennifer Liu had discovered, he showed that the county's reasonable efforts had been minimal at best. Tax notices had been sent only to the property address, even though county records showed that no one had lived there for decades. No attempt had been made to contact family members in Atlanta or to search for current addresses. The legal advertisement in the newspaper had been published in tiny print in a section that almost no one read. The testimony that changed everything came from Robert Hayes, a former county commissioner who had served during the 1980s. Hayes was now in his 70s and battling cancer. Against the advice of his own lawyers, he had decided to testify about what really happened during the special assessment program. Hayes revealed that the program had been created specifically to acquire valuable rural property that could be developed as the area grew. County officials had identified properties owned by Black families who lived in other counties as the easiest targets because they were less likely to fight back or to have political connections. The goal was to transfer land from unproductive owners to developers who would create jobs and increase the tax base. Sterling objected furiously to Hayes's testimony, arguing that it was hearsay and speculation, but Judge Martinez allowed most of it, ruling that Hayes was speaking from his personal knowledge as an elected official who had participated in the program's creation and implementation. Hayes's testimony provided the direct evidence of discriminatory intent that Marcus needed to prove his civil rights claims. The third week of trial featured expert testimony about Black land loss across the South. Dr. Patricia Williams explained how systematic discrimination in lending, legal representation, and government services had made Black families vulnerable to losing their property through tax sales, partition sales, and other legal mechanisms. She testified that an estimated 90% of Black agricultural land had been lost since 1910, representing billions of dollars in stolen wealth. The defendants countered with their own experts who argued that property loss was a natural result of economic forces and demographic changes. They claimed that families who moved to cities naturally lost connection to rural property, and that tax sales were a necessary tool for ensuring that land remained productive. They denied that racial discrimination played any significant role in the process. But the defense's case was seriously damaged by the discovery of additional documents during the trial. A paralegal working for Sterling's firm accidentally included privileged communications in a document production, revealing that the development company had known about potential problems with the property title when they first purchased the land from the county. The documents showed that the company had conducted its own research and found evidence that the Williams family might still have valid claims to the property. The revelation that the developers had known about potential title problems, but had proceeded with the purchase and development anyway, undermined their claims of being innocent purchasers who deserved legal protection. It also raised questions about whether they had conspired with county officials to hide the questionable nature of the tax sale from future homebuyers. As the trial entered its fourth week, something unexpected happened. Several homeowners from Riverside Estates approached Marcus and asked to meet privately. Led by Michael Chen, a software engineer who had bought his house in 2015, they explained that they had been following the trial closely and were disturbed by what they were learning about how their neighborhood had been developed. Chen and 6 other homeowners announced that they supported Sarah's claims and believed that justice required returning the land to her family. They acknowledged that this would create problems for everyone who lived in the development, but they argued that the solution was not to perpetuate an injustice. Instead, they proposed that the development company and county should compensate all affected homeowners for any losses while allowing Sarah to reclaim her family's land. This unexpected support from some of the very people Sarah was supposedly trying to harm created a media sensation. The story of homeowners supporting the black woman who was challenging their property rights became a symbol of racial healing and justice. It also put enormous pressure on the remaining defendants to find a settlement rather than continue fighting. Sterling tried to minimize the impact of the defecting homeowners, arguing that they represented only a small minority of the affected families, but their testimony about discovering the truth about their property's history and choosing to do the right thing despite personal cost was powerful and moving. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides knew that Judge Martinez faced an incredibly difficult decision. The legal issues were complex, the emotional stakes were enormous, and any ruling would have far-reaching implications for property rights and racial justice throughout Georgia and beyond. For Sarah, the wait for justice had already lasted more than 3 years since she first discovered that old deed. Soon, she would learn whether the American legal system was finally ready to confront the systematic theft of black wealth that had been ignored for far too long. Sarah's first day at Cedar Falls High School marked a turning point that no one could have predicted when she had been abandoned on that highway 6 months earlier. Principal Robert Hayes had worked extensively with Dr. Martinez and the school's special education coordinator to ensure that Sarah's transition would be smooth and successful. The school had never had a blind student before, but they were determined to provide her with every opportunity to thrive. The student body's initial reaction was a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, but Sarah's confidence and personality quickly won over her classmates. She had learned from her therapy sessions that she could educate others about blindness in positive ways, helping them understand that she was capable of much more than they might initially assume. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Williams, was amazed by Sarah's analytical skills and her ability to discuss literature with insights that impressed even the most advanced students. Marcus Thompson continued to serve as an unofficial mentor to Sarah, checking in regularly and offering practical advice about navigating challenges. His delivery route took him past the school several times a week, and he made a point of stopping by to see how she was adjusting. Linda Thompson had become like a second mother to Sarah, providing the kind of consistent female support that had been missing from her life for so long. The investigation into Monica's whereabouts took an unexpected turn when authorities in Arizona contacted Officer Reynolds. Monica and Emma had been located living under false names in Phoenix, where Monica had been arrested for attempting to defraud an elderly man in a romance scam. The arrest revealed a pattern of manipulative behavior that went far beyond what she had done to Sarah's family. When Sarah learned of Monica's arrest, her reaction surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of feeling satisfied or vindicated, she felt sad for Emma, who had been dragged into her mother's destructive lifestyle through no fault of her own. Dr. Martinez helped Sarah understand that this empathy was a sign of her emotional healing, rather than weakness or confusion. Sarah's father received notification that Monica would be extradited to face charges related to Sarah's abandonment, but he and Sarah made the difficult decision not to pursue the most serious charges. They had built a new life in Cedar Falls, and prolonging their connection to Monica through lengthy legal proceedings would only delay their complete healing. Officer Reynolds supported their decision, understanding that sometimes moving forward was more important than seeking revenge. The most significant development came when Sarah discovered her passion for advocacy work. Margaret Foster, her tutor, had encouraged her to write about her experiences as a way of processing her trauma. Sarah's essays about living with blindness and surviving family abuse were so powerful that Margaret suggested submitting them to a national contest for young writers with disabilities. To everyone's amazement, Sarah's essay won first place in the national competition, earning her a scholarship fund and an invitation to speak at a conference for social workers and educators. The recognition brought attention to Cedar Falls and highlighted the community's remarkable response to Sarah's crisis. Local media picked up the story, and Sarah found herself in the position of being able to help other young people facing similar challenges. The scholarship money solved a problem that had been weighing on Sarah's mind. Her father's income was sufficient for their basic needs, but college had seemed financially impossible despite her academic achievements. The prize money, combined with additional scholarships that became available due to her recognition, opened doors to higher education that she had never dared to dream about. Sarah's relationship with Emma Rodriguez deepened into a true friendship that enriched both their lives. Emma's experience with hearing loss and Sarah's experience with blindness created a bond that helped both girls understand that disabilities didn't define their worth or limit their potential. They began volunteering together at the Regional Center for People with Disabilities, sharing their stories and encouraging others. The transformation in Sarah's father was as remarkable as her own growth. He had learned to communicate openly about his feelings and his mistakes, creating the kind of honest relationship that he had never managed to achieve before. His guilt over failing to protect Sarah had evolved into a determination to support her dreams and advocate for other families facing similar challenges. As Sarah's junior year progressed, she began making concrete plans for her future. Her grades were excellent. Her extracurricular activities demonstrated leadership and community service, and her advocacy work had given her a clear sense of purpose. She wanted to study social work and law, with the goal of helping other vulnerable children who might be facing abuse or neglect. The community that had rallied around Sarah continued to benefit from her presence among them. Her success story had inspired other residents to become more aware of people with disabilities in their area and to look for ways to offer support and inclusion. The high school had implemented new programs to promote awareness and acceptance of differences, making the school environment more welcoming for all students. Dr. Martinez noted in her records that Sarah had achieved something remarkable. She had transformed from a victim into a survivor, and then from a survivor into a leader. The girl who had been abandoned because she was seen as a burden had become someone who enriched every life she touched. Her journey was far from over, but the foundation she had built in Cedar Falls would support whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. 3 years after her abandonment on that lonely highway, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the state capitol building, addressing lawmakers about the need for stronger protections for children with disabilities. At 17, she had become the youngest person ever invited to testify before the state legislature on family services reform. Her journey from victim to advocate had captured national attention and inspired policy changes that would protect countless other vulnerable children. The speech Sarah delivered that day was powerful and personal, drawing on her own experiences while advocating for systemic changes. She spoke about the isolation that many disabled children face when family members see them as burdens rather than individuals with unlimited potential. Her recommendations for improved oversight of family situations involving disabled children were based on extensive research she had conducted with the help of legal experts and social workers. In the audience that day sat many of the people who had played crucial roles in her transformation. Marcus and Linda Thompson had driven 4 hours to hear her speak, proud of the young woman they had helped rescue from the roadside. Dr. Martinez and Dr. Kim were there representing the medical and mental health professionals who had supported her healing. Officer Janet Reynolds attended in her dress uniform, representing law enforcement's commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Sarah's father sat in the front row, his eyes filled with tears of pride and lingering sadness for the years when he had failed to see his daughter's true strength. His own transformation had been complete as well. He had become an active volunteer with family support organizations and had testified alongside Sarah about the importance of not letting grief blind parents to manipulation and abuse within their own homes. The legislation Sarah advocated for passed unanimously, creating new requirements for monitoring children with disabilities in family situations where step-parents or other caregivers had primary responsibility. The law also mandated training for social workers and teachers to recognize signs of disability-related abuse and neglect. Sarah's story had provided the emotional foundation for policy changes that would have practical, life-saving implications. College acceptance letters had arrived throughout the spring, with prestigious universities competing to offer Sarah full scholarships. She had chosen to attend the state university, where she would double major in social work and pre-law, with the goal of eventually attending law school and specializing in disability rights advocacy. Her decision to stay in state meant she could remain connected to the Cedar Falls community that had saved her life. The search for Monica had ended 8 months earlier, when she was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her various fraud schemes in Arizona. She had never shown remorse for abandoning Sarah, even when given the opportunity to apologize as part of her plea agreement. Emma, now 13, had been placed in foster care with a family that specialized in helping children whose parents had been incarcerated. Sarah had written letters to Emma, offering support and friendship if she ever wanted contact, but understanding that Emma might need time and space to process her own trauma. Marcus Thompson's delivery business had grown significantly, partly due to the positive attention his act of kindness had brought to his company. He had hired additional drivers and expanded his service area, but he still made time to serve as a mentor for young people facing challenges. He had established a small scholarship fund for students with disabilities, inspired by seeing what Sarah had accomplished when given proper support and opportunities. Cedar Falls had changed as well. The town's response to Sarah's crisis had revealed a capacity for compassion and community action that residents hadn't fully recognized before. The high school now had one of the most comprehensive disability support programs in the state, and the town had become a regional model for inclusive community development. Other municipalities sent representatives to study how Cedar Falls had successfully integrated support for people with disabilities into all aspects of community life. Sarah's relationship with Emma Rodriguez had evolved into a partnership that extended beyond their personal friendship. Together, they had created a peer support program for teenagers with disabilities, offering mentorship and advocacy training. Their work had been recognized by national disability rights organizations, and they had been invited to present their program model at conferences across the country. The piano lessons that had started as community charity had developed into a serious musical pursuit. Sarah performed regularly at community events and had even recorded a CD to raise money for the Regional Disability Center. Her music provided an outlet for emotions that couldn't always be expressed in words, and her performances moved audiences who understood the journey that had brought her to that stage. As Sarah prepared for graduation and college, she reflected on the incredible chain of events that had transformed her life. Monica's cruel abandonment had been intended to destroy her, but instead it had led to her rescue by people who saw her true worth. The community that embraced her had benefited as much as she had, discovering their own capacity for making a difference in someone's life. Dr. Martinez's final report on Sarah's case noted that she had achieved something extraordinary. She had transformed personal trauma into a force for positive change that extended far beyond her own healing. The girl who had been discarded like trash beside a highway had become a leader whose influence would protect and inspire others for generations to come. Sarah's story became a testament to the power of human kindness and the potential that exists within every individual, regardless of their challenges or circumstances. Her journey from abandonment to advocacy proved that sometimes the most devastating experiences can become the foundation for the most meaningful contributions to the world. The unthinkable thing that happened after Monica abandoned her wasn't just survival. It was transformation, triumph, and the creation of a legacy that would outlast any cruelty that had been inflicted upon her.